Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to be doing another part in the series of going over Thomas Hodge and Horace Bushnell and giving their reasons for it, for being against slavery or being for it, and just how the culture back then viewed it. Now, for Thomas Hodge, he believed that Christians often err in being more prohibitive than the Bible by labeling things like dancing and drinking alcohol as something necessarily sinful without regard for context. He'd say one shouldn't make something a sin that God doesn't forbid, nor something obligatory that God didn't command. He held to a negative principle that said what the Bible doesn't forbid is permitted. That doesn't mean what is permitted is a good or bad thing, but rather it is indifferent in that the Bible doesn't specifically forbid it. So Hodge lacked a verse in the Bible that said involuntary servitude was wrong. Hodge held that to say a slave was a master's property was to say that the master has a right to the slave's labor but not necessarily to his person. That doesn't reduce them to mere things, and it means you can only use them according to the nature God has given them. Hodge said that the hereditary aspect reflects the hierarchical organization of society where children take the rank of their parents. That doesn't mean he liked that aspect, but he was just saying that it didn't deny the humanity of slaves. He thought certain laws that forbid slaves from learning and laws that forbade them from having effective marital and parental rights and overall subjected blacks to white people was unjust. Because Hodge viewed slavery as an indifference, he wasn't obligated to view it as essentially good or that it should be permanent. Hodge believed that the Bible taught principles of love, and while it didn't preclude slavery, its effects resulted in more egalitarian and less restrictive forms of social organization. While the Bible didn't condemn being a slave owner, it did condemn all unjust treatment of slaves, and that if Southerners recognized the basic rights of slaves, that would result in the gradual abolition of slavery. Hodge held all races came from the one couple, and no one was denied salvation based on race. Slaves merit humane treatment because they are humans, and while he believed not all people had an equal claim to freedom, they did have basic rights such as the right to marry and have a family, the right to education, the right to acquire property, and the right to be protected from abuse. Slaveholders thus had a duty to protect the basic rights of their dependents. Because Hodge believed in the basic similarity of people, he couldn't accept American slavery as permanent, as it was based on the idea that the differences between the races was permanent and essential. Humans coming from the same biological family, though, didn't mean that Hodge thought that accidental differences didn't occur. He believed that environmental factors created racial differences and that these differences resulted in superior and inferior relationships. Blacks were temporarily inferior to whites in America, but not necessarily elsewhere. This unevenness meant blacks weren't competent enough for civil equality with white Americans. He didn't use the Bible to justify his beliefs in African inferiority, as the Bible wouldn't support that. He believed in the separation of church and state in the sense he believed while they all have a role in maintaining a society, they should keep to their respective spheres. Blacks' inferiority to Hodge was only a temporary state and was something that could be improved. Individual Christians have a right and a duty to make informed judgments, express informed opinions, and to try to persuade others. The church, though, he believed didn't have the right to make sweeping judgments on the issue. He recognized, though, that sometimes the civil law had to be disobeyed in order to obey God. Hodge condemned Southern secession as a breach of faith, and while he did support decolonization at one point, he dropped it when it became impossible. Hodge didn't believe that all social and political questions were beyond the church, even though some are. He was against James Henry Thornwell's argument that the church had no right to condemn international slave trade or to interfere in worldly policies at all, as that would make the church empty and incomplete and to be in complete control by the world. By advocating his moderate emancipationist strategy, he felt he was working within the limits of the Bible and the Constitution. He only supported the 13th Amendment because the Civil War made the continuance of slavery incompatible with the preservation of their own liberty and independence as a nation. He didn't set a date for blacks when they should be allowed to vote. He believed they should be prepped for it. He said that no man has a right to exercise a privilege that they are not qualified for. To quote on how Hodge was not a defender of what Eugene Genovese identifies as a particular Southern worldview, one that made slavery the cornerstone of society and even of civilization. More specifically, Hodge saw the end of slavery on the near horizon and welcomed the imminent demise as a sign of improvement, an indicator of the moral progress of individuals and of American society as a whole, while Southern clergy seemed willing to postpone the end of slavery indefinitely. Horace Bushnell had an odd set of beliefs, as he on one hand opposed slavery greatly, but with the same amount of vigor pushed that once slavery was over, blacks would go extinct. He opposed the Fugitive Slave Act along with many other pro-slavery laws, but predicted that blacks wouldn't be able to thrive outside of slavery and would die out in America, and he repeated those beliefs from the 1830s all the way up to the Civil War. Horace was a complicated man to figure out in terms of his beliefs about race before the Civil War and even more so in it. He did have a consistent position though, despite that. Horace's beliefs came about from his theological commitments that gave him an open-ended theological method which had an organic anthropology. Horace came from a mixed denomination background, with his father being a Methodist and his mom an Episcopalian. As a young man, he challenged religious traditions, like how he said Paul was inconsistent in wishing himself a curse for the sake of his brethren. He became somewhat of a religious skeptic while in Yale and tutored on law to undergrads. The Trinity was something that puzzled him and was holding him back from being a fully committed person of the faith, but he eventually said that his heart conquered his mind on that. This commitment to heart-based thinking made him enemies of conservatives who wanted to carry the Enlightenment tradition of common sense. He was inspired by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Aids to Reflection, which said that religious language was a kind of poetry that expressed heartfelt truths that were too mysterious to be condensed down to formulas. Christianity to Horace became a lifestyle more than a strict adherence to a set of doctrines. He became a pastor of North Church in Hartford, where he spent his entire career, and he was well loved by his church, whom even helped him when he was ill health. Despite being liberal, he didn't cast off tradition indiscriminately, but he rather wanted to adjust Protestant elements to the current world. He was trained in Reformed theology that was modified by New England Congregationalism. He had the benevolent-centered morality of Samuel Hopkins and an activist spirit of Nathaniel Taylor. He shared the Romantic movement's vision against the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment, which was less confident of objective truth and placed more value on subjective knowledge. With it, he shared their vision of mysterious organic influences that binded people together and gave them a distinct character. Horace's frame of reference was Congregationalism, and like the Presbyterian Church, the Congregational way was defined by polarity. While he didn't think Congregationalism was the only way to do things, his thinking was influenced by their beliefs about the structure of church and society. Unlike Presbyterianism, Congregationalists located power within each local congregation, whom could run its own affairs with very little influence. He valued individual autonomy and mutual accountability like the church. Well, that is all for today. Can't wait to see you until the next part. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.